Hello, welcome to Tasting with Mike and Matt. I'm Mike Veach, and my partner in crime, Matt Cohorse, is actually behind the camera today. We are starting a new series of videos. Not sure how often we'll do these, but we're going to do these fireside chats. Matt's idea, he says that he wanted me on camera talking history. I thought I would start off with some 20-minute or so videos talking history, and we're going to start at the beginning. Always a good place to start. With American distilling, it goes back to the early 1600s when the first pot still was purchased in Brooklyn, New York, and then in 1640 there was brandy distillation on Staten Island. Could be apple brandy, but most likely it was brandy distilled from some wine shipped over from Europe that was going to go bad if they didn't distill it, so they distilled it into brandy. And early on, brandy and rum were the big products, particularly up in New England. Rum distillation was big. It is part of the infamous slave triangle, where you would get sugar cane and molasses from the West Indies, distill it and ship it to Boston and places up east. They distill it into rum. They would send that rum to Africa to trade it for slaves. Slaves then shipped down to the West Indies and traded for for molasses and sugar cane. Not a pretty part of American history, but it is part of it. So those were the drinks of choice. Brandy and was easy to make. Brandy, of course, is spirits distilled from a fruit wine, and rum is distilled from sugar cane or molasses. Now, this went on for a couple hundred years almost. Then the American Revolution happened. Then you got people moving out west, settling out west, and you start seeing distillations of rye whiskey and corn whiskey.
So rye was before like regular whiskey, or?
Well, rye is regular whiskey, but
right.
It was before a corn whiskey, mostly because it was brought over. The use of distilling rye grain came over from the Germans. You know, a lot of people give the Scots and the Irish, total credit for creating American distilling, but really the Germans had just as much to do with it as the Scots and the Irish. Some of the earliest distillers was a German immigrant called Overholt. Jim Beam. The Beam family are German immigrants, and they started distilling in 1795. Rye whiskey is earlier recording of rye whiskey being distilled than there was bourbon or corn whiskey even, because you get out on the West in particular. Kentucky was the first American West, of course. But, we're talking about Western Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Western North Carolina, Tennessee, those areas. They're being settled. And it's hard to get trade goods into these areas. Sure, you could, get brandy or rum from New England or wherever else. But, you make your own whiskey, it's easier. Plus, whiskey solved the problem of transporting the grains and such back, to the markets in the East. They're very bulky, grains are. Much more bulky than a barrel of whiskey or a jug of whiskey. Because early on, distillation took place. It wasn't an aged product. It was a white dog, as we call it now, or new make. And the people would get this, and they would find ways of make it more drinkable. One of the ways was to make gin out of it. Matter of fact, I know of the Corliss family had a gin distillery in Providence, Rhode Island in the early 1700s. Of course, gin was also a very popular drink at the time. Other people would make things like cherry bounce or blackberry cordial. Cherry bounce, I've seen recipes where they take cherries and macerate them in the whiskey. Seen other where you just take roots from a wild cherry tree and boil it down into a real strong tea and mix that with your whiskey. Blackberry cordial, same thing. You take some sugar and some blackberries and you mix it in with your whiskey and let it sit for a while, and then you drain the solids off, and drink the liquids. All very popular things during this time. With the beginning of American whiskey distillation, it becomes more and more important, like I said, as the American Revolution takes place. The American Revolution, the slave triangle was cut off. Sugarcane and molasses coming from the West Indies was cut off. You had to make your spirits out of something, because spirits were a very important part of life at this time, particularly out west. You get out west and the settling, you come out to a new country, whether it's western Pennsylvania or West Virginia, Kentucky, or Tennessee, or wherever. You had to bring everything you needed with you, and then you had to build your own cabin and your own barn. When you weren't doing this, you were taking care of livestock, clearing fields, planting fields, harvesting fields. You were working from sun up to sundown. Whiskey was an important part of this, because every morning you'd get up and you'd have a little shot of whiskey as an eye-opener. A lot of people don't realize that the mint julep was a way of making the whiskey taste a little better in the morning. You put a little sugar and a little mint in with it, and you drink it. It was a breakfast drink.
So they would have coffee and whiskey in the morning?
If they could get coffee.
Oh, okay.
You're talking about out west, it's 300 miles over rough roads to get to the nearest store that might have, coffee. I mean, as the West was settled, you'd start getting regular merchants that would start bringing in things like coffee and such. But still, it was expensive. So you work all day. You have your little drink in the morning to get you going. You have a drink at night because your muscles are just sore. But whiskey had other important roles too. If you went to a wedding or a funeral or a barn raising, someone brought a jug of whiskey. But it also had a very important economic, because hard currency was hard to come by. The United States was still, even after the United States was formed, hard currency was hard to get because they just didn't have the capacity to mint a whole lot. So what you do? You bartered. You could take a quart of whiskey into your local store and get you, a half pound of nails or a pound of sugar or a yard or two of cloth or whatever you needed. And this is one reason why, for the most part, whiskey wasn't put in the barrel. It was put in the jug, because you're talking about a farmer distiller now. We're talking about distilleries that had anywhere from 20 to 120 gallon stills. And you work all day on a 100-gallon still, you might get 5 gallons of whiskey. Maybe 10 if you were really good at it and knew what you were doing and you got a good yield. You put that in a jug. For one thing, if you put it in a barrel, take you 10 days to fill your 48-gallon barrel, which was the standard size at that time, 48 gallons. More importantly, you lost a day's work. That whiskey soaked into the wood. You put whiskey into a barrel, 53-gallon barrel a day, about first thing that happens within the first day or two is that you're going to lose 3 or 4 gallons as it soaks into the wood. You can't afford to do that. So you put it in jugs, and of course jugs were cheaper. Plus, you're bartering. It's easier to put it take a jug into to a local store and barter a quarter or half gallon of whiskey for whatever you need than it was to take in a 48-gallon barrel and and say, here, give me change.
Yeah. So how long does it take them to make the white dog when they're doing their distilling back then?
Like I said, you could do it in a day as far as the distillation process, but the fermentation is going to take you 3 to 5 days or more. It takes a lot of effort to make whiskey, but if you're good at it, it was a very profitable thing to do. As the Revolutionary War went on, the Shanks Distillery up in Pennsylvania famously states that they supplied whiskey to George Washington, his army. Because the army, every day, that you were allowed a shot of whiskey as part of your daily rations, if you had it. And, whiskey also had a very important medicinal role to play. Stomach ache or headache or muscle aches, you drank whiskey to take care of it. I'm not sure how much they knew about the actual antiseptic part of it, as far as putting it on wounds or such, but if you were a soldier that was wounded, they gave you a shot of whiskey anyway, just to numb the pain a little. Whiskey played an important part. And of course, the Revolutionary War comes to an end, a new government is formed, and this new government started off, the Articles of Confederation, very ineffective government, failed after a few years. And that's when they got together and wrote the Constitution, the form of government we have now. In order to get this Constitution passed, the new government pledged to assume all Revolutionary War debts from each individual state. Under the Articles of Confederation, every state had to pay their own Revolutionary War debt. In Virginia, in particularly, that was by giving out land in Kentucky. In order to pay this debt, though, they needed an income. So they put some tariffs on some luxury items being imported in, and they created the whiskey tax. The whiskey tax, designed by Alexander Hamilton, and it was designed to be a very unfair tax. Hamilton wanted to do away with this idea of the small independent farmer distiller and create big distilleries, big industries. So the tax, first of all, what made it kind of unfair was that it had to be paid in specie, hard currency. I've already said, hard currency is hard to come by. The further west you went, the harder it was to come by.
So no bartering.
No bartering. Second thing that made it unfair was that they had government agents, gaugers, that would come into the distillery every day. If you made 10 gallons of whiskey, you were charged your tax on 10 gallons of whiskey. Now, this was fine if you were in a big city or, Philadelphia, Providence, wherever. But out west, there were lots of small farmer distillers spread out over many different miles. The government couldn't afford to hire a gauger for every farmer distiller.
Right.
So they hired just, one or two agents to cover hundreds of square miles. So this gauger would go into a distillery and say, you've got this amount of whiskey, or this still of this size. You should be able to make this amount of whiskey per day. This is the tax you owe us for this next year, based on making that amount of whiskey every day. Well, first of all, a lot of these farmers weren't making whiskey every day. Very seasonal. They would make their whiskey using the grains left over from the previous year to start with, make room in their grain bins for the next crop as it goes in. And then, after a certain amount of time, they would quit doing it. And they were usually only making it in the fall through the winter, maybe into the spring, depending on how much grain they got. Some of them were so good at distillers, their neighbors were bringing their grains in and have them distill it out for them. But still, they weren't distilling all year round, so they were being taxed for whiskey they didn't even make. In all fairness, if it wasn't for that specie requirement, they probably would have grumbled, but went ahead and paid it if they could pay it in whiskey or something like that. And you're talking about a generation who just fought the British for about 8 years over taxes. They rose up in rebellion. Western Pennsylvania, Western Virginia, Kentucky. The rebellion spread. This is, 1791. There were revenue agents that were tarred and feathered and run out of town on a rail, as they say.
You only have like 1 per 100 square miles, so it's like,
yeah,
they're very much outnumbered.
Right. And of course, I'm sure the Gauger had some friends and such in the area, but still, they were outnumbered. And things came to a head up in Pennsylvania when the local Gauger's cabin was put under siege by a bunch of rebels, whiskey rebels. His house ended up being burned, and somebody got killed. It was one of the rebels, but still, somebody got killed. And that's when the government decided they had to do something about it. So George Washington raised an army larger than anything he ever commanded during the Revolutionary War, and started marching up to Pennsylvania, where he turned it over to Harry Lighthorse Lee. He returned to Philadelphia at the time. And they marched into the western Pennsylvania to put down the Whiskey Rebellion. Now, one of my favorite quotes on this comes from Thomas Jefferson, where he says something along the lines that a rebellion was declared, armed against, marched against, but never found. They marched into western Pennsylvania. They arrested 3 people. One of them was a lunatic. The other one was an imbecile. The other one was just an unlucky vagrant preacher. I'm not sure what the difference between imbecile and a lunatic is necessarily, but imbecile was also, or the lunatic rather, was also a preacher, and it may have been a more polite way of calling him an imbecile. But anyway, they were found, put on trial. One of them, I think, was found guilty, but he was later pardoned. That was in western Pennsylvania. Now, things were just as bad in Kentucky, but Kentucky was a different problem. For one thing, it's over the Appalachian Mountains into the west, the first American West. The government didn't think they could get an army across the Appalachians and keep it supplied and, keep it going, and particularly without the support of the local people. So they handled this in a different manner. They put a very sympathetic judge in charge of the courts in that system. And what he did is he tied the legal cases up in court. Kept them tied up until I think most of them were settled in the 1830s. And they were settled without interest or penalties. What made the 1830s important is the fact that by that time, hard currency was available.
So it was floating around more prevalent, like those areas that...
Yeah, America had expanded westward, even further west, and hard currency, they had currency being made, and people had money. That's, the way that it was settled in Kentucky. Now, one of the big myths about the Whiskey Rebellion is the fact that Kentucky got its distillers from the Whiskey Rebellion as they fled west. Well, that's bullcrap. Kentucky had plenty of distillers before the Whiskey Rebellion. The people in the Whiskey Rebellion, like I said, for the most part, went on distilling and ignored the whole thing after, the army marched in. They weren't arrested or anything. They just agreed to pay their taxes and go on about their business, except for a few of the leaders. Now, a few of the leaders did flee. They fled westward. They didn't stop in Kentucky. Federal marshals had just as much jurisdiction in Kentucky as they did in western Pennsylvania. They fled all the way to Spanish territory, New Orleans in particular. That was the end of the Whiskey Rebellion. So now, what I decided we'd taste today is some new make whiskey. This is some new make Potter Jane White Dog, as they call it, White Dog. This is the wheated recipe, actually, the corn, wheat, and malted barley. Yeah, this is 128.1 proof. This is right off the still. They'd have to reduce this down even more to put it in the barrel. But this is very much what they would have been drinking in this period.
So they would take that, and you said cherry bounce would be, is it like muddled cherries in the White Dog? Is that kind of what they did?
Well, they would put cherries in it and let it macerate in it.
Okay.
Or, like I said, they would take cherry root and boil it into a strong tea.
Have you ever tried anything like that before?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah? Is it good?
It's okay.
It's okay.
When you're talking about drinking unaged whiskey, and particularly unaged whiskey in many cases from people that were not the most talented distillers in the world.
Yeah.
It can get kind of rough. And, I have seen there's a recipe from the Beale Booth papers at the Filson Historical Society on rectifying the whiskey by running it through a barrel, a wooden barrel or bucket about yay tall that had a false bottom with perforations in it. And they put down some wool cloth, and they put down some sand, and they put down some charcoal. And then they put down another wool cloth, and then another layer of charcoal, and did this until the bucket was filled, and then they would drip their whiskey through it.
Oh, wow. That's interesting.
Well, it's also known as the Lincoln County process in Tennessee.
Oh, okay.
But it's a very common practice of doing it. This is in Kentucky in 1798 or so. They were doing this.
Okay.
So it was something that was very common. It does take some of the rougher edges off the whiskey. So this whiskey is very corn forward, but it's also got a very sweet note to it. You get a little bit of a fruitiness to it, a little maybe peach or apricot, maybe some very ripe apple or pear. Definitely get the corn. You get that apple, pear, a little bit of a pepper spice, and that's what you get. And this is a very good made White Dog whiskey.
Yeah, I think we've tried that before.
Yes, I think we did a video.
We did a video on it, and I was surprised at how many notes you can pick up on a White Dog like that. If it's a good White Dog. Because usually if it's just regular White Dog, it just tastes like corn, right? A lot of times.
No, they'll have other. It depends on who makes it and what they're going for. Yeah, I mean, you should get some flavors from the yeast.
All right, so we made it through the Whiskey Rebellion, and then what will we do next? You think? What's your next?
Next one's going to be on the Birth of Bourbon.
Birth of Bourbon. Okay.
And hopefully it will be out in another month or so.
Okay.
So if you like this video, please hit subscribe, leave a comment. That means ask any questions. I'll be happy to answer them. And always remember to drink responsibly. Cheers.